Causes of the outbreak of the Korean War. Key question. Why did the USA and the UN intervene in a Korean Civil War in 1950? Origins of the Korean split. Japan controlled Korea from 1895 to 1945. The USA and the USSR agreed during World War II that after the Japanese surrender, Korea would be given to the Soviets in the north and the USA in the south for supervision. Soviet-American relations deteriorated from 1945 to 1946 from Cold War tensions. The USA started to create a South Korean state in its own image, and Soviets did the same with the North. Establishment of North and South Korea as separate states. The United States of America encouraged UN-supervised elections that created a pro-American/anti-communist state in the South. Syngman Rhee was elected leader of South Korea, now officially called the Republic of Korea. In 1949, North Korea, officially called Democratic People's Republic of Korea, was established under communist leader Kim Il-sung. Both leaders wanted reunification on their own terms. A map showing Korea and East Asia in the 1950s. The U.S. entry into the Korean War, reasons 1 through 6. Reason 1, American anti-communism. The USA feared the communist ideology and rejection of capitalism/multi-party states. The USA feared the spread of communism to other states that would then be enemies and refused to trade goods and services. Reason 2, the world balance of power. The USA felt that by 1950 the world balance of power was tilting in favor of communism. The USA had lost Eastern Europe and conditions worsened after the communist victory in China, the Berlin blockade, and Soviet atomic bomb testing. Communism was rapidly expanding throughout Asia, and the United States of America wanted to contain it. Reason 3, McCarthyism and domestic political concerns. Truman declared communism as evil in his Truman Doctrine speech and was criticized by Republicans for the loss of China. February 1950, McCarthy made accusations that there were communists in the State Department. Truman wanted to seem tough on communism, and war would make the American people rally around him as he looked for support in the next election. Reason 4, the NSC-68. 1950, Truman commissioned the National Security Council to create a plan, the NSC-68, on how to handle the communist threat. The NSC-68 claimed that the USSR wanted total Eurasian domination. The NSC-68 recommended that the United States of America create a powerful bomb, build up military power, raise taxes to help finances, seek allies, and unite the American people to oppose communism. Reason 5, fears for Japan. After World War II, the USA had revitalized Japan, and it was now an American ally. Japan's new society would be jeopardized by its proximity to Korea if a communist unification occurred. Reason 6, the UN and lessons from history. Truman thought World War II was started partly because the League of Nations had failed. Truman thought the new UN was being tested when North Korea attacked South Korea and wanted to show the American support and avoid another world war. Key debate. Key question. Why did the Korean War begin? The changing Western viewpoint. The traditional Orthodox viewpoint of Western historians was that the Korean War was started because of communist aggression. A Western revisionist historian, Bruce Cummings, said this was a Korean Civil War with fighting motivated by nationalism and desire for reunification by the Korean people. Cummings said the USA was partly responsible for the war because they imposed a regime on South Korea that was not favored by the Korean people. U.S. intervention. A traditional interpretation. The United States of America was motivated by anti-communism and containment. The revisionist interpretation. U.S. policy was motivated by economic imperialism.
The course of events in the Korean War in 1950. What military developments occurred in Korea in 1950? The start of the Cold War. June 25, 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. Truman sent U.S. air and naval forces to help South Korea, as well as U.S. ground troops to Korea and the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Straits. The U.S. mobilized the UN to respond to aggressive action, but not to declare war. The U.S. Pacific commander was General Douglas MacArthur. Tensions between Truman and MacArthur. Truman wanted a limited defensive war in South Korea, as opposed to MacArthur, who wanted a full war against North Korea. Truman rejected MacArthur's strategy, as it would mean war against the USSR and China. The fall of 1950. U.S., UN, and ROK troops were struggling and defensive. Soldiers were arrogant, had no motivation, and were inexperienced. Korea's conditions were difficult, with high temperatures, and there was communication problems distinguishing North Korea, South Korea, and Chinese troops, as well as poor air-ground coordination. U.S. did not have the tanks for defense, therefore got pushed into Pusan perimeter. Changing U.S. war aims. U.S. had control of the skies and the seas, and MacArthur's amphibious assault allows the U.S. to break out of Pusan and move all the way up to regain Incheon and Seoul. Causes change U.S. war aims, and in September 1950, there is motivation and momentum, and U.S. troops pass the 38th parallel. China's entry into the Korean War. This causes China to intervene as a way to repay Korea for its help during China's civil war and reestablish its power. Chinese cause U.S. troops to become outnumbered and out of supplies, and the winter conditions freeze weapons and the soldiers, contributing to the retreat of U.S. forces. Frozen Chosin was one of the battles in which 25,000 U.S. soldiers were combating 125,000 Chinese soldiers. The constant battle between the U.S. and China on the 38th parallel caused major tensions until an armistice was signed in 1953. Section 4. A UN War. How far did other nations contribute to the Korean War? Was the Korean War a U.S. war or a UN war? The Korean War was a U.S. war. 90% of the troops were U.S. or ROK, which was the South Korean troops. Only 40,000 troops were sent from other nations. MacArthur did not directly communicate the war plans through the UN. Canada and Britain's role in the Korean War. Communications between the British, Turks, and U.S. ROK were poor, which led to many misunderstandings. Canada joined NATO in 1949 and was the third largest contingent in the Korean War, with 27,000 soldiers. Canada and the British were very helpful to keep the U.S. aggressions down to a level in which would prevent World War III from occurring. Latin America's role in the Korean War. Latin America found Korean War irrelevant because 1. They had their own economic problems, 2. They resented U.S. neglect of aid, 3. The U.S. demand for resources was not of benefit to them, 4. Military agreements caused controversies, 5. There was no tradition of having troops involved in regions abroad, and 6. Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Uruguay, and Mexico did not send forces when President Truman asked, just war equipment. Colombia was the only one of the nations in which sent 6,200 men for the Korean War in hopes of receiving more U.S. aid.
Ending the Korean War 1951 to 1953. Key question. How and why did the Korean War come to an end? U.S. recovery in 1951. 1951. The U.S. public wanted out of the war. 66% of the population was polled, and of that 66%, 49% felt troops in Korea was a mistake. Chinese retook Seoul in January 1951, and the morale of U.S. troops was low. Matt Old Iron Tits Ridgway, the new ground commander, turned morale around. Chinese supply lines overstretched. Flatter South Korea was better for U.S. tanks and artillery. In March 1951, U.S., UN, and ROK forces retook Seoul and moved back to the 38th parallel. MacArthur's dismissal. MacArthur opposed containment in the policy of limited war in Korea. December 1950, MacArthur publicized his disagreements with President Truman. He violated the JCS directive. In April 1951, Truman dismissed MacArthur. MacArthur's dismissal. View from MacArthur's supporters. Truman's approval rating fell to 26%. MacArthur was met with 500,000 supporters and a ticker tape parade in New York City. A poll revealed 69% of Americans thought it was wrong to fire MacArthur. 100,000 letters were sent asking to impeach Truman. On the other side, with Truman's supporters, we see some recognized MacArthur's underestimate, the Chinese. Some felt MacArthur committed acts of insubordination, and JCS feared MacArthur might provoke a full-scale Sino-American war. This is a picture of MacArthur standing being driven along Broadway for his New York ticker tape parade in April 1951. The Armistice, 1953. Why the combatants wanted peace. June 1951. China requested an armistice because of large losses and domestic issues. Soviets and North Koreans realized unification was not happening for the Korean peninsula. In the U.S., in a 1951 poll, the public did not support the war. In the U.S., 30,000 troops had died, and government finances were damaged. The JCS was more worried about the USSR and did not want World War III in Europe. Pressure from around the world showed that the U.S. was damaging the reputation. Why peace came 1953. In June 1951, China proposed an armistice. However, fighting continued because both sides wanted to save face and not let the other gain territory. Truman refused to allow Chinese POWs to be freed. He insisted they wanted to defect to the free world. Eisenhower's presidency, January 1953, and Stalin's death, March 1953, both contributed to the 1953 armistice finally being signed. Here's a summary diagram of the ending of the Korean War, 1951 to 1953. The diplomatic and political outcomes of the Korean War. How did the Korean War affect U.S. politics and diplomacy? The Korean War and U.S. policies. Intensified McCarthyite hysteria, which started in 1950. The war proved to them the communist conspiracy. 85 probes and communist influence in the U.S. were done. The Korean War damaged Truman's presidency. It cost the U.S. $67 billion, which increased inflation, and 500,000 steelworkers had to strike for better wages in April 1952. Truman's failure to obtain a congressional declaration of war put the blame on him. The war is often referred to as Truman's War. Truman couldn't control Congress. He didn't seek re-election in 1951, and the Republican Eisenhower won. Public opinion shaped the outbreak and the course of the war. Korean War and U.S. foreign policy. Containment and credibility. The dismissal of MacArthur for publicly seeking out war with China demonstrated containment. Stopping communist expansions and saving South Korea also contributed to the idea of containment. The U.S. secured Japan's security and development, which made Japan a U.S. ally. The U.S. failed to reunify Korean Peninsula because of Chinese military forces. Korean War and U.S. foreign policy. USA and Asia. The Korean War shifted focus from Europe to Asia. We can see this through the increased financial aid to the French in Vietnam. There was a big impact on Sino-American relations in a negative way. It took more than 2 decades before China and the U.S. exchanged ambassadors. Korean War and U.S. foreign policy, arms race, and American alliances. The Korean War promoted Soviet and U.S. military buildup, escalating into an arms race. Truman accelerated the U.S. hydrogen bomb program, strengthened NATO, and remilitarized Germany. There was also an increase in U.S. relations with Germany, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Korean War and U.S. foreign policy, Cold War turning point. Historian James Maturay saw the Korean War as a critical turning point in the Cold War because of the increased U.S. defense spending, commitment to NATO, support to regimes like Sang Nam Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek, continued policy of global intervention in Vietnam, Korean War and U.S. foreign policy, USA, Korean War, in Latin America. Focus on Asia confirmed the U.S. marginalization of Latin America. In 1951, the Mutual Security Act provided $38 million in military assistance to Latin America regimes to combat communism. In 1951, Bolivia's right-wing government refused democratic election. In 1952, the government was overthrown. However, Truman refused to recognize a leftist government of Victor Paz de Cerso, who won the 1951 election.